We are very pleased to have Elizabeth Morrison here this evening, and I will formally introduce her in just a minute. First, I just want to mention a couple of upcoming programs. On your seat are some flyers a week. Let's see, the first one. This Friday, Dana Casperson will be here discussing and demonstrating conflict resolution while moving. She is going to do choreographic public dialogue, which promises to be very interesting. She is a professional dancer. She has written a book, the cover of which is on one side of that folded flyer, on conflict resolution. And as a movement person, she believes in movement as a way to do group things, and she promises it won't be embarrassing. You won't have to sing or dance. You will do some movement which sort of groups you into different clusters of people deciding questions. It sounds very fascinating. A week from tonight, Robbie Gilbert, who's a professor at Lyndon State College, will be here talking about gaming culture, not cards, not bookkeeping, bookmaking, video games, that kind of stuff. I say it with a bit of hesitation. I am not a gamer. Many young people are. This is a culture which is going to rival the Super Bowl sooner or later. Pretty soon we're going to see the Super Bowl of gaming on television. There are huge groups of people who gather in stadiums to see professional gamers play. He will talk about lots of aspects of this. There are many women, there are few women game designers, and this big, awful discussion has blown up about women gamers being harassed. This is my interpretation. You might have a different one, because a lot of the games are very male-centric in terms of the way the characters are presented, in terms of the goals of the game. He will discuss many aspects of the interest of gaming, Gamergate, so-called. So that is a week from tonight. On your seat is the next First Wednesday flyer. It's there for you to see, so I won't belabor the point there. Let's see, these are bigger flyers for the two programs that are coming up. I was remiss in not saying I'm Bob Jolly, Athenaeum Director. Hello, good evening, thank you for coming. This book will be in our collection. This is Dana Casperson's book, so she has a very straightforward book on conflict resolution, and there'll be dancing or movement. So there will be lots of things. Now, first of all, I want to say nothing happens at the Athenaeum without sponsorship, and first of all, to the voters of this town, if you are among the voters who voted for us, thank you very much. And we are very grateful. The town appropriation is $115,000. It is the single biggest special appropriation on the ballot. It is 20% of our budget. We could not function without that money, so we are very grateful to the people, the voters of this town. This program wouldn't function without support. The First Wednesdays program. We have two sponsors, Steve Adler, who is here with his wife Lisa, and his partner Daniel McCabe of Adler and McCabe. So far, so good. I have botched this introduction the last 3 months in a row. So we are grateful to Steve Adler and Daniel McCabe, and a round of applause for them. The other series sponsor is the Friends of the Athenaeum. They run secondhand prose. If you buy a book, if you donate a book, if you buy a pie in the fall, if you make a pie in the fall, all good things happen, and those good things come to us. So we are grateful to the Friends of the Athenaeum. This individual program is sponsored by Gil Steil Associates, and I don't see Gil here. I think Gil is perhaps basking in another continent, but Gil Steil sponsored this particular talk with Elizabeth Morrison, and we are grateful to him and his company. I think that takes care of everything but a proper introduction to our speaker. Elizabeth Morrison is an associate professor of religion at Middlebury College, where she has taught since 2003. Her research focuses on pre-modern Chinese Buddhist history, especially the history of the Chan Zen tradition. But her teaching interests include religion throughout East Asia, Buddhist monastic culture, religion in contemporary China, and Buddhism in the modern world, including the West. She received her BA in religion from Amherst College and her MA and PhD in religious studies from Stanford University. She is a member of the advisory board of the Journal of Chinese Religions, which publishes peer-reviewed research articles, book reviews, and other communications once each year. In 2014, Professor Morrison was awarded a fellowship from the Marion and Jasper Whiting Foundation for a project entitled In the Company of Pilgrims, the Four Great Places of the Life of the Buddha. The grant enabled Elizabeth to travel to northern India and Nepal to visit sites significant in the life of the Buddha and the history of the Indian Buddhist tradition. And here's where one can get in trouble. I took this from the net. I hope it's true. I mean, I hope it's accurate. I'm sure it's true. Be forewarned, Mr. Librarian. The goal of the project is to deepen our understanding of early Indian Buddhist tradition while observing and experiencing the phenomenon of contemporary global Buddhist pilgrimage. The experience will enhance the full range of classes she teaches in Asian religions and additional insight for us. Please welcome Professor Elizabeth Morrison.
I didn't make it to Nepal because of the trains, so I only made it to 3 of the great sites out of the 4 great sites. So I want to thank the Vermont Humanities Council and the Athenaeum for giving me this chance to talk to you, and of course thank the taxpayers of St. Johnsbury and the sponsors. So I want to explain first my interest in this topic and then explain what I'll be doing tonight. As Bob just explained, I'm actually primarily a scholar of medieval Chinese Buddhism. At the moment, for example, when I have time away from my family and my teaching and my department demands, I'm translating an essay written by a 12th century Chinese statesman defending Buddhism against Confucians. So I spend time doing stuff like that. But I'm also really interested in contemporary Buddhism, especially, well, not especially, but including Buddhism in the West. And by the West, I primarily am meaning here in North America, although I do also read about other parts of the world that we would consider the West. And I'm interested in Buddhism in the West for 2 reasons. First of all, I live here and now, and so do most of my students. All of my students live now, not all of them come from here, which is actually one of the glorious things about teaching at Middlebury College, is we have such a wonderful assortment of international students. But the second reason that I'm interested in Buddhism in the West is because, for me, one of my long-standing intellectual preoccupations is the adaptation of Buddhism to China and China to Buddhism, a very long and important process in the history of China and in the history of Buddhism. And for me, the spread of the Buddhist tradition to the West is a parallel. It's an analogy. And so for me, it's very interesting to watch this unfolding before our very eyes. Really in the midst of it. So that's one of the reasons why I keep up on the scholarship about Buddhism in the West and why I keep my eyes open and talk to people. And actually one of the highlights of my recent trip to India was not just being in the company of Buddhists from all over, but in particular talking to folks who've converted into the tradition or who've come from Asia, gone to the West, practiced their Buddhism there, but are having a chance to come back as pilgrims. So it was really quite remarkable. I could be somewhere and someone would have been standing next to me speaking Vietnamese and then turn to me and say, "Hi, I'm from Texas." So it was just, it's wonderful and interesting. So that's where I'm coming from in bringing this material to you. What I thought I would do tonight is start with the life of Thomas Merton and the Trappist monk and writer, and then use his encounter with Buddhism to bring out some of the characteristics of the Western encounter with Buddhism. And here I have to stop and say there is no single Western encounter with Buddhism, and I'll try to make that clear. There are many different people who are Western, and there are many different forms of Buddhism. But I will start with him, try to draw out what I can from his life, and then also point out some things that are not typical in his encounter with Buddhism, and then go on to describe further characteristics which we can't find in his life, but which I think are very interesting to consider when we talk about Buddhism in the West and in the US. I do want to be clear that I'm interested not only in people like Merton, who came from a Western background, who was born in Europe and lived much of his life in the US. I'm also interested in people who came from Asia to the US with Buddhism as part of their Asian inheritance. I've also designed this so that I'm going to try and leave room for a question and answer session at the end that involves anybody's insights and observations, because this is an ongoing phenomenon. I certainly don't know everything about it, and I'd love to hear what people's questions and their own stories and encounters. So to start with Thomas Merton, and it could be that some of you know far more about him than I do, but I'm certainly somebody who has read his work and is very interested in him. Ooh, did I just throw sound? I don't know what to do about that. That was strange feedback. Oops, suddenly fell. Did I just switch it off? I'm rebooting.
Technology, it's just
Yeah.
awful. Try it again. Just press and hold and see.
Press and hold. If not, I can stand there. Oh, I'm back.
I have a feeling that may fluctuate.
If it happens again, okay. I can also be pretty loud, but okay. We'll go back. Thomas Merton. He was born before this. Thomas Merton was born in 1915, and despite having been raised with little religious training or education in an extended family that included connections both to the Church of England and to the Quaker movement, he quite famously became a Catholic in his early 20s as a graduate student in New York. And then in his late 20s, actually mid-20s really, he began his life in the order of the Cistercians of the Strict Observance. There are different kinds of Cistercians, and he belonged to the order of the Cistercians of the Strict Observance, which most people call the Trappists, after the great La Trappe Abbey in Normandy. But he started his life with them at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. As is common in some orders, he was also ordained as a priest some years later. Now, while living at Gethsemane, he wrote an autobiography. He was fairly young to be writing one, but he was encouraged by his higher-ups in the monastery. And it's said that he said himself that once he started writing, it just flowed out. He actually wrote it quite quickly. And it was accepted by a press in New York, it was published, and it became this amazing success. So the Seven-Story Mountain attracted attention well beyond the Catholic community. And it actually became a bestseller in 1948. There's a great story about how the New York Times, even though it was selling really well, the New York Times didn't want to put it on their bestseller list because it was a religious book. And they went back and forth with the publisher until finally the New York Times put it on their bestseller list, because it's a question of categories. It has remained very popular, and it's in print to this day, and it really has to be in that group of books that changes people's lives. You can talk to many people for whom this was a life-changing book. And he continued to write, steady stream of writing. Even though he had duties at Gethsemane, he always was able to keep writing. And he wrote books about interfaith dialogue. He wrote books about Asian religious traditions. And it wasn't until 1968, after much hoping for this, that he was finally able to take a trip to Asia. His first trip to Asia, long anticipated. But a few months into the trip, after meeting a number of important Buddhist and other religious leaders, he died in Bangkok at age 53, so fairly young, and what's understood to be an accident, a stupid accident, and he was electrocuted. So what I want to talk through, the first half of the talk really, is what are we to make with Merton's interest in and encounter with the Buddhist tradition, and how is it representative of Western encounters with Buddhism more broadly? And to talk through this, I've identified 4 themes that I want to work through. The first is Buddhism as a corrective to modern Western problems. This is something we see in Merton, and I want to talk about that more broadly. The second is his interest in meditation as a form of authoritative experience. The third is his encounter with multiple forms of Buddhism. And the fourth is the question of identity, religious identity. So I'm going to talk through each of these at some length and then turn to the things that we don't see in Merton that I think are still important to note. I'll do those more briefly, and then I hope be able to turn to your questions and your comments. So this first idea, the idea of Buddhism as a corrective to the modern West, we really have to say, well, why was Merton reading about Buddhism in the first place? And why was he seeking out Buddhist teachings? Well, first of all, this goes back very early in his life, that he was quite curious about a multitude of religious traditions. In fact, it's clear that he was curious about a lot of different religious traditions, and he was really very impressed with them. He was impressed with the mystical Muslim groups. There are multiple groups called Sufis. He was really interested in early Taoism. And this curiosity in him actually predates his conversion to Catholicism. One of the more striking stories in The Seven-Story Mountain tells the story of him as a young and fairly confused young man. I think he was 22, 23 at the time, maybe 22, maybe being at Columbia or just having finished his degree, or maybe having just started his MA, quite young. And he heard from a friend about a Hindu teacher who had finished, a Hindu man, Bengali, I believe, who had finished a PhD at the University of Chicago and had come to New York. Oops, there I go again. I think I better just switch. Okay, I'll gesture from back here. Take this off. So he heard about this Hindu teacher that people said was amazing, and he went to talk to him. And famously, he sought out this teacher, whom he describes as being in monastic robes and keds. And he says, this man's name was Mahamanabratra Brahmachari, so a celibate monk in the Vaishnavite tradition. And this man told him, I can tell you about Hinduism, but really what you should do is turn to your own tradition. And he told him to read Thomas à Kempis, the Imitation of Christ, and he told him to read Augustine. He hadn't read the Confessions yet. So this Hindu teacher said to him, turn to your own tradition. You're turning to me for things that your tradition already has. And this redirection back to Christianity really helped lead to Merton's conversion to Catholicism and then his monastic vocation. But he continued this redirection back to Christianity, or to Christianity, because he hadn't been very involved previously. He'd had, some lovely encounters with cathedrals, etc. But he hadn't really deeply gotten involved in Catholicism. He hadn't converted yet. This redirection didn't mean that he lost his curiosity, and it's clear that he was a voracious reader of texts about other religious traditions, especially their mystical aspects. He was most interested in the contemplative and the mystical. And really, in this way, he's quite typical of some intellectuals in mid-20th century U.S., in that there's this interest not only in mystics of the Abrahamic traditions or the monotheistic traditions, but also mystics from other traditions. Now, for him, and this was this big theme that I wanted to bring out, he was really looking to mystics, particularly non-Western mystics, to correct the woes and the ills of the modern West. He and others talked about over-intellectualization, materialism, industrialization, secularism, and really talking about secularism as leaving people in a spiritual vacuum. Really what the earliest sociologists talk about when they talk about alienation. This is what he was concerned with. And in the mid-50s, he wrote a book called Thoughts in Solitude, in which he writes, "The murderous din of our materialism cannot be allowed to silence the independent voices which will never cease to speak, whether they be the voices of Christian saints or the voices of Oriental sages like Lao Tzu or the Zen masters, or the voices of men like Thoreau or Martin Buber or Max Picard. It is all very well to insist that man is a social animal. That fact is obvious enough, but it is no justification for making him a mere cog in a totalitarian machine, or, he adds, in a religious one either." he goes on to say, no amount of technological progress will cure the hatred that eats away at the vitals of materialism, of a materialistic society like a spiritual cancer. The only cure is, and must always be, spiritual. In other words, he looked around him, he saw problems, and he did not think that the solution would come about through technology, through politics, through social change. He really was looking for a spiritual solution to those ills. He saw the spiritual as foundational. And this is the thing that's not atypical for this period, but it's very striking in him, is that he was willing to look beyond the Catholic Church for inspiration and for fellowship in trying to solve these problems. His timing was also excellent, because it just so happened that at that moment, it really didn't come to fruition until the mid-60s, but starting up in the late 50s all the way into the mid-60s, there begins to be a new openness in the Catholic Church towards other religious traditions. And in 1965, a statement came out under Pope Paul the VI. Having trouble reading my Roman numerals. So this is a statement from the Vatican. The Church, therefore, has this exhortation for her sons: prudently and lovingly, through dialogue and collaboration with the followers of other religions and in witness of Christian faith and life, acknowledge, preserve, and promote the spiritual and moral goals found among these men, as well as the values in their society and cultures. So if you think about the Catholic Church in previous centuries, this is a new openness. So his timing was good, and this allowed his superiors to give him some more leeway in the work that he was doing. So he was turning to the contemplative and mystical Christian tradition, and other Westerners, both Christian and Jewish, have in recent decades sort of rediscovered these elements of their traditions. Nevertheless, I continually encounter Westerners, Americans, and other Westerners who have very set ideas that the West is rational and unspiritual, and that the East, I hope you can hear my quotation marks there, the East is mystical and in touch with the truth. For me, as a scholar, the very idea of the East, of Asia, all of Asia, as a monolithic cultural singularity, it's one of the biggest obstacles I face in my teaching. So I really delight in moving my students past some of these assumptions, moving them to see that China and India are as different from each other as either is from Europe. Just because they're supposedly on the same continent, they are not the same place. Also, I really just think we need to throw away this term, the East and Eastern, because not only does it leave out a lot of the world, but it's just not a good description. I also think that I hope that I'm often helping my students move past a mischaracterization of the West that's based on a lack of knowledge, ignorance about Western heritage, because really what often happens is that we confuse the West with the modern, and we forget about a deep, long history. So that's a little rant, sorry, that I have to talk about. But what's interesting is Merton's not falling into this East-West talk very much, because he's aware that there's a mystical side and a very spiritual side to the West. But he's very much of his moment, and that many people were thinking about these things. And he doesn't fall into this, but he overlaps with the people who are looking to Asia as corrective for the ills of the world, and that idea is still very common. Now, I have to say, this isn't just a mistake, if I can call it that. It's not really a mistake. It's a movement. It's what people do, but it's not just Westerners who do that. I spend a lot of time in China, and I can tell you that people in China constantly look at the West for corrections, to solve their problems, sometimes to solve their spiritual problems. And right now in China, Christianity, especially Protestantism, is doing extremely well, in large part because people in China now, many of them are attributing certain elements of the West to Christianity, things that if we know our history, we would say, actually, Christianity and capitalism do not have an easy relationship. They don't go hand in glove. Democracy and Christianity don't start together. They've come together in some places. So it's very easy to make these mistakes across these big cultural divides. And Merton is, like many of us, often trying to solve the problems of the here and the now by looking either to the past or to other places. Now back on my list of 4 things. The second thing on my list was meditation and experience. Now it shouldn't be any great surprise to us that a man who would become a Trappist, the Cistercians are often said to take a vow of silence. They actually don't take a vow of silence, but they follow the rule of Benedict, and they observe a lot of silence. They actually even use sign language to avoid a lot of chatter. They do speak, but they try to only speak intentionally and purposefully and in service of God. But a person who would choose that life, it shouldn't be a surprise to us that he would look at Buddhism and be very interested in the contemplative life there. And in this way, he's very typical of many people's interest in Buddhism, and that is to say, for many people in the West, when they hear about Buddhism, the first thing they think of is meditation. That is the main characteristic that they associate with it, and there's great interest in that. But Buddhism is not at all singular. It does not come in one flavor. It is a vast tradition with a great deal of internal diversity. Running through that diversity, however, there is an assumption built into the bedrock of the Buddhist tradition that meditation is the crucial liberating practice. There are different forms of Buddhism that teach different forms of meditation, but it is really a fundamental that you can't arrive at awakening without meditative practice, a sustained meditative practice. And in most traditions, it's understood lifetimes of meditative practice. That said, even though you could ask virtually all Buddhists in the world this question, they would say, yes, meditation is necessary for liberation. But when you really ask them, so are you meditating? Actually, the majority of Buddhists in the world would say, yes, meditation is necessary for awakening, but I'm not doing it. I'm not ready to do it in this life, right? So it's a slight misperception to think that, more than a slight misperception, to think that all Buddhists are meditating all the time. Even, it's really actually been an elite practice, a practice for monks and nuns. And even among that elite, not everybody does it, partly because there are other things you have to do. You have to teach people, you have to keep the monastery running, administrative duties. Some people are scholars, some people do a lot of devotional practice. So most of the time, most Buddhists are not meditating. That said, most of them very much believe that they are preparing for lifetimes devoted to meditation. They're just not doing it yet because they're not ready to do it. In the West, however, most people who are coming to Buddhism from a non-Buddhist background, a non-Asian background, they've been attracted to Buddhism precisely because of this practice, this elite practice, and Merton was among them. His interest in contemplative practice and his desire to get to know Buddhist monks who were devoting themselves to contemplative practice just like him, albeit in a very different context, that's not surprising at all. But I do want to ask, why are all these other folks who aren't Trappists so interested in contemplative practice? Now, there's an answer that I can offer that comes from the scholarship that's been done about American religion, and that is that scholars of American religion, historians of American religion, have identified a possible reason. They talk about a striking American emphasis on experience as authoritative, and they say this starts early in the 19th century. I mean, it really comes to prominence in the 19th century. And when they say authoritative experience, they're talking about the Second Great Awakening. They're talking about tent revivals. They're talking about seances being run by spiritualists. They're talking about across the American religious landscape, a lot of people looking beyond their traditional religious teachers, looking beyond their traditional scriptures and wanting to experience something that feels real and confirms them in living a certain way. So this emphasis, it actually has probably multiple roots. So I'm going to really just mention one of them, and that is this very modern suspicion of authority, that it's really out of a suspicion of institutions, suspicion about institutions and leaders. That said, I think that sometimes this questioning of traditional authority, it's also related to the rise of science. It's people looking for empirical support for the choices they're making in their lives. And this kind of skepticism or people looking for something empirical, I think we see it not only in religious and spiritual settings, we also see it in the political setting. So I was just at town meeting 2 days ago, and we have it early where I live. And, you know, over and over again, my fellow citizens stand up and say, well, you know, I don't know about marijuana legalization. Let's wait and see how it goes in California. Let them go first. Not California, so Colorado. Let them go first, and we'll see how that goes, and we'll learn from their mistakes, and we'll read the studies that are no doubt being done. And then the person who stands up and says, well, they can say that school district consolidation is going to save money, but could someone prove to me that school district consolidation will save money? I mean, there's this desire for things to be, for there to be proof that we're not going to just act on principles, and we're not going to act because somebody said so, but because we really want to know. Now, when it comes to religion, many modern people have wanted to practice religion in this way. They don't want to be entirely dependent on somebody else's say-so or some book. And this is, I don't want to call it a flat-out empirical attitude, but it's quasi-empirical, right? It's looking for some kind of support or proof. And that dovetails beautifully with the Buddhist tradition, because the Buddhist tradition from the very beginning has as one of its principles that you don't take things on faith. In Buddhism, faith is not, in most forms of Buddhism, no, all forms of Buddhism, faith is not what you arrive at. It's not the pinnacle of your religious experience. It's simply what gets you started. It's the first stage. You just need to have enough faith that the Buddha achieved awakening and that his path is going to lead you there too, to get started. But the idea is that as you walk the path, you will come to know that it is true. So he ran an experiment, you're repeating the experiment. So it's quasi-empirical in this way. And he's famous for having told his disciples, don't accept the Vedas, don't accept the Brahmanical tradition. Just because that's the tradition doesn't mean it's true. He also said flat out in the earliest layer of Buddhist literature that we have, don't take my word for it. You know, he said, don't take this on faith, don't just listen to me. You need to go and through meditation, arrive at the truth of this yourself. And of course, one of the things that one has to know about meditation in the ancient Indian context is that when the ancient Indians talked about the senses, they didn't talk about 5, they talked about 6. The mind is itself a sense that can directly perceive reality. So meditation is understood to work in that way. So you can see how things happening in the Western context and the American context are dovetailing with what Buddhism seems to be offering. And now we come to this third question, and that is encounter with multiple traditions. Buddhism, like other religious traditions that have spread very widely, it's really not a single tradition, and we can call it that, but if you look closely, you can see it's actually a collection of many related traditions. And those many different strains of Buddhism have arrived in the US through every kind of contact, through immigration, through teachers coming from Asia to the US, through books, through folks going to Asia and then returning. And the many different parts of the Buddhist tradition, the many different versions of the Buddhist tradition, they are all present in the US to some degree. One indication of this is actually the title of a major American Buddhist magazine that some of you might be familiar with. It's called Tricycle. It's very glossy, very beautiful, fun to read. It doesn't represent the whole American Buddhist community by a long shot, but it's called Tricycle. Partly in a kind of playful allusion to the fact that American Buddhism is young, right? And we're all wheeling around on tricycles, apparently. But it's also a playful allusion to the fact that Buddhism is described as having 3 turnings of the wheel. So when the Buddha first preached, that was called the turning of the wheel of the Dharma. And then you get 2 later movements. And so it's these 3 different major forms of Buddhism that make up the 3 wheels. In the case of Merton, like many Americans who did not have any family connection to Buddhism, he first encountered Zen. Now, Zen is the Japanese elaboration of a Chinese school that claims to go all the way back to the Buddha. I've spent a lot of my career working on the history of this tradition. And it attracted a lot of attention in the US, especially starting in the 50s and into the 60s. Academics and intellectuals were starting to learn about it, to write about it, even to start to practice about it. And very much along these lines, Merton was reading about Zen. He was corresponding with the Japanese author of popular books on Zen, and he was inspired by Zen poetry and Zen art and so on. But that's not where it stopped for him. Like many folks in the West, there are multiple forms of Buddhism present here. So he also corresponded with a prominent Theravadan writer and translator. Theravada is the form of Buddhism that grows out of the earliest form of Buddhism. We find it in South and Southeast Asia. So he was corresponding with this guy who was a monk in Sri Lanka. Interestingly, this guy was actually himself a convert to Buddhism. He had started out as a German Jew, and then managed to get, in the mid-30s, he managed to get himself and his mother out of Germany. He got his mother safely settled, he thought, in Vienna, and went to Sri Lanka and became a monk. And then when things heated up in Vienna, he managed to get his mother out, and she came to Sri Lanka and actually became a Buddhist. And then he had a very long career. He lived into his 90s, became a really important translator, and very highly respected in Sri Lanka. So Merton was corresponding with this guy, as well as with D.T. Suzuki, who was an important popularizer of Zen. And then on his trip to Asia, in '68, Merton also met Tibetan teachers. He met the Dalai Lama. This was '68, so the Dalai Lama was young, quite a young man, I think just in his 30s at that point. And we don't know how Merton's, and he also met other Tibetan teachers who really impressed him, and he met Tibetan teachers from not all the different lineages, but many of them. And we can't know, because of his death, we can't know exactly how his involvement with all these different schools would have turned out. That said, this gives us a kind of jumping off point to talk about the diversity of Buddhism in the West and what that's led to. I see that there are a range of possibilities. There are some people who find a Buddhist teacher, a Buddhist community, a Buddhist principle, a Buddhist practice, and they develop a kind of exclusive commitment to it. Others freely involve themselves with multiple traditions. One extreme example of this would be that there's a scholar named Jeff Wilson who teaches at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, and he recently, just a couple years ago, published a book with the astonishing title, Dixie Dharma. It is a study of a Buddhist center in Richmond, Virginia. And interestingly, he makes a whole argument about how Buddhism in America is developing differently given regional differences. And he says, this is Virginia, there aren't that many Buddhists. So what they've done is band together. And so it's one place, it's one building. It's actually apparently just down the block from the Confederate Memorial Museum. And there are several different kinds of Buddhism practiced there. And it's not just that the space is shared and you belong to group A and then you leave and then group B comes in. There are a number of people who participate in multiple traditions. So there's Pure Land Buddhism there, there's Zen practice, there's I think at least 2 different schools of Tibetan practice there, and then also a kind of something called a meditative inquiry group, which are the people who like meditation but aren't sure they believe in karma and reincarnation. So that's an extreme of it. But what he points out is that this could not possibly exist in Asia. In Asia, these traditions are all in different places and the people are speaking different languages. But in the US, because of the proximity, you were getting this kind of fusion and cross-pollination of different traditions. And we can't know what Merton would have done with that because he was interested in Zen, he was interested in the Tibetan stuff. We can't know what he would have done, but this is definitely a characteristic of Buddhism in the West that all of this is happening. And this leads us very neatly to issue number 4, which is the issue of identity. In the West, generally, people think about religion as a marker of identity, right? Most people expect that identity is exclusive, it is singular. On a survey, we get one spot. We get one box. We're only allowed one check on a survey. This is beginning to change, especially as religious intermarriage becomes more and more common, and also as some people start to articulate what scholars call hybrid identity, where people insist on being more than one thing because they are. In general, though, the pre-modern West is still very much with us, and in that way, the legacy is that religion is a matter of exclusive identity. And traditionally, in Europe, in the West, people who tried to blur or erase boundaries or straddle boundaries made other people very uncomfortable, very unhappy, and they sometimes got burned at the stake, right? This is not a comfortable thing. Now, Merton did not finish his Asian journey, and he did not live to see the journals that he kept on that journey published, but they were published. And after they were published, some Catholics were made very uncomfortable by some of the things that he said. So I want to kind of talk through that question of his Catholic identity. There are two things that have really drawn people's ire or discomfort, or drawn out people's discomfort, and that is a story that he tells about a dream, and also one comment that he's said to have made. So this was what he said about his dream. Last night I dreamed I was temporarily, and I'm not sure where he was when he had the dream, but he was somewhere on this itinerary of South Asia. Last night I dreamed I was temporarily back at Gethsemane. I was dressed in a Buddhist monk's habit, but with more black and red and gold, a Zen habit, in color more Tibetan than Zen. I met some women in the corridor, visitors and students of Asian religion, to whom I was explaining I was a kind of a Zen monk, and Gelugpa too, together when I woke up. And Gelugpa is a particular line of Tibetan, it's a Tibetan school. So he had this dream in which both his clothing and what he said to people gave him a sort of a hybrid identity. Somebody who was with him on this trip, for part of this trip, also reported that Merton said that he, quote, wanted to become as good a Buddhist as I can. Now, these comments have made people in the Catholic community really uncomfortable, and friends of Merton have responded by saying, no, he never had any intention of leaving the church. Don't worry. He said Mass just 2 days before he died. But for our purposes, what's interesting is that Merton seems to have had the sense that he could, on some level, be a good Buddhist and be a Catholic priest and monk. He didn't seem to think that talking to Buddhist teachers, doing Buddhist meditations, reading Buddhist texts would undermine his Catholic and Christian identity. In fact, he and many others involved in interfaith dialogue and practice report that their commitment to a particular tradition actually deepens through conversation and shared practice with others. And I have to say, one of the reasons that I think that this could happen in Merton's life, or start to happen, and one of the reasons I bring this out as something that's interesting in the Western encounter with Buddhism, is that the Buddhist tradition really offers itself up for this. This kind of combination, or this kind of use of Buddhism. And that's because of this, what I described before, as a quasi-empirical attitude that, try the experiment, run the experiment, do the meditation, because that means that it's very easy for Buddhist teachers and others to regard meditative techniques coming out of the Buddhist tradition as merely techniques, something that you can take out of the tradition and use, and maybe embed in a different context. The other thing is that the Buddhist tradition has pretty much always coexisted with other religions in Asia, and Buddhist teachers in Asia are pretty comfortable with that. They'll often say things like, well, those folks over there, they're asking different questions, they're getting different answers, we're asking these questions. So the Chinese would often say a Confucian at the office, as in civil service, but you go home and you're a Buddhist or you're a Taoist. Same day, same person. You just need different traditions for different parts of your life. We also have to remember, and I think this is crucial, that traditional Buddhists are generally thinking of a path that takes many, many lifetimes. They're not thinking about, get it right, you've got one lifetime to get it right or not. So for many Buddhists, their attitude is that the practice of a religion other than Buddhism, if it leads you to be moral, if it leads you to be compassionate, if it moves you forward in any way, that's good, and you will create merit, and karmically you will benefit. Now, those same Buddhists will very likely, we're talking about traditional Buddhists here, they'll very likely also assume that you're going to move on to Buddhism, but they're not actually denigrating those other traditions or saying that they're bad in any way. They're quite open to them. In fact, sometimes Buddhists, especially Vietnamese Buddhists, kind of freak Westerners out by referring to Jesus as a bodhisattva. So they're actually taking Jesus and making him a figure of compassion within Buddhism. This is something that Buddhism and Hinduism do constantly to each other. So it's something that we see in ancient India. Because actually, when I was just on this trip looking at Buddhist pilgrimage sites, one of the most hilarious and enlightening things was, I don't mean literally enlightening, but was that Buddhists from all over the world know that when you approach a holy place, you circumambulate 3 times clockwise, Hindus circumambulate both ways, and they're coming to these places because they think that the Buddha was actually an appearance of Vishnu. So they're showing up to a pilgrimage to somebody else, and they will be, so all these Buddhists are going around this way, and they're going the other way, and everybody just gets along. No one tells them to go the other way. Everybody can be there. It's all good. It's good karma for everybody. It's merit. But this combination is common. That said, Buddhist teachers everywhere will often start sermons by saying, this is a rare and precious human life, and you should work hard to make progress. But it's understood that this path takes time, and telling people to commit to more than they can handle is not productive. So Buddhists often hesitate to push people to get more involved than they're ready to do. There's some exceptions about that, but there is the sense that you don't want to make promises or take vows that you can't keep, because it's worse to take the vow and break it than to not take it in the first place. At any rate, this leads to a more relaxed attitude about religious identity among Buddhists, except, and there are cases where Buddhists feel threatened or put upon or aggressive, and in those cases it's a bit different. At any rate, this means that for Buddhism in the West, while many people involved, some of them don't identify fully with Buddhism at all, or they've developed these hybrid identities. Scholars often call these folks Buddhist sympathizers. There's even a special category, which there's a scholar at University of North Carolina who has the most wonderful name. His name's Thomas Tweed. Thomas Tweed has come up with the term Nightstand Buddhists. And he's not using this in a bad way at all. He's simply describing the fact that there are many people in the U.S. who don't identify as Buddhist. They're not connected to a Buddhist community. They don't have a teacher, but they read books written by Buddhists or about Buddhism, and they keep them on their nightstands, and it has a place in their life. And I have the sense that there are a lot of Buddhist sympathizers and a lot of nightstand Buddhists around, and that means that when Pew Research goes out and asks people, are you Buddhist, or what are you? They come back with a really low number. 0.7 of the U.S. population answers the question yes to are you a Buddhist. That was in 2008, and I don't think it's changed too much. But I think that we need to look past 0.7 to see that actually Buddhist ideas, Buddhist practices, Buddhist attitudes are actually, I think, far more potent and present in the U.S. than 0.7%. Would suggest. Okay, so I think I've used almost all my time, and now I'm going to be a little bit quicker in talking about beyond Merton. I'm just going to kind of list some characteristics and then turn to all of you. So if we move beyond Merton, it's really important to, of course, say, and my title didn't do this well, that the appeal of the Buddhist tradition is not unitary, it's not singular. For different people, Buddhism has different appeals, different appeal. And I want to run through 7 characteristics that we see in not all, but many American Buddhist communities. And here, I'm saying American Buddhist very inclusively. That first characteristic is that, of course, for folks, and this is something like a third of the folks who do identify themselves as Buddhist in the U.S. are Asian American. For those folks, this is their home tradition. There's a wonderful book written by a scholar named Sharon Su called Being Buddhist in a Christian World. It's about Korean Buddhists, Korean American Buddhists in LA. And she's talking about how they're in a doubly Christian world because there are so many Korean Christians who are Korean emigrate to the U.S. at a higher rate than do Buddhists. And then, of course, the U.S. is very heavily Christian. So to be a Korean Buddhist in L.A., you're in this doubly Christian world. And what she describes is that this is true of many other immigrant communities, that it's the temple becomes one's home community, sometimes in the face of discrimination, but it's really sometimes in the face of missionary pressure from usually Christianity or forms of Christianity. If you're in Utah, it's a different group of folks. That said, the temple then expands. It does things that it doesn't do at home in Asia. This is something that we see, Catholics did this, Jews have done this, where the place of religious worship becomes actually the place of ethnic identity. It's the place where you can make sure your children learn to speak the language, where your children can participate in lots of activities. So you see temples becoming community centers along the lines of, the YMCA or a Jewish community center. Now, this has sometimes happened really under a lot of discrimination, and certainly Japanese Americans are the most, have faced the most discrimination. One of the sadder episodes in the already very sad story of the Japanese internment camps is that actually when the U.S. government started feeling suspicious about Japanese, the very first people they looked at were the folks they thought were most typically Japanese: martial arts teachers, Japanese language instructors, and Buddhist priests. And those were the first people to be under surveillance. That said, Asian American Buddhist identity has been quite fluid, and as you move into later generations, sometimes those folks are participating not in a quote-unquote ethnic or immigrant community, but in a different community because they want the other things being offered. So now I'm going to start going a little bit more quickly. Now, second point, for all that I emphasized before that a rejection of authority is a characteristic of modern U.S. religion, it's actually also really true, both for people who've inherited Buddhism and people who've adopted Buddhism, that they're drawn to it precisely because it offers authority, not from their experience, because of teachers, charismatic teachers, or sometimes teachers who aren't charismatic, but who have really compelling things to say. So those teachers often have really strong claims about authority based on lineage and connection to previous masters. You see that especially in Zen, in Tibetan masters. You go to any website of a Buddhist community, and in the sidebar, our lineage. And they'll tell you why you should listen to them and to their teacher. So it isn't always about rejecting authority. Sometimes it's looking for authority. Thirdly, monasticism, very important in Buddhism as a whole, not as strong in the West. While there are some folks who continue, both folks who've inherited Buddhism and folks who've converted to it, who become monastics, this is not very strong. Instead, what we're seeing developing here is a kind of retreat Buddhism, where people do traditional monastic practices, but they do them in an intense form on a retreat. So you see that places that in Asia would have been monasteries now are retreat centers, and there might be some monastics who live there, but mostly it's folks coming from householder lay lives to do intense practice. And here's a place that's really out of accord with Thomas Merton, because he was a monastic. So he was interested in talking to other monastics, but he's, in that sense, atypical of American interest in Buddhism. Fourth point, social justice. Americans of all sorts, American Buddhists of all sorts, have brought social justice to the forefront in their practice of Buddhism. So you find Buddhists in prisons, serving the homeless, running AIDS hospices, and they were some of the first folks running AIDS hospices out in California. Just as people began to figure AIDS out, working in piecework, job training, etc. This is partly a modern characteristic, but this is also, it's just American. This is what people expect religious people to do. They expect them to apply their principles. So as interested as people are in meditation, they also want to see people acting out their tradition. And so we see that rather prominent, not as prominent in Asia. Fifth, we see a particular American interest in developing clear-cut rules of how leaders should behave, ethics. So you get fairly early on a consortium of American Buddhist teachers from a variety of communities laying out the law. This is partly in response to scandal, but partly just because cultural gaps between Asian teachers and American students often, or Asian teacher but an Asian community that is running the show, and Asian American community that's running the show and needs to take a stronger hand. So we see more later leadership and also just ethics being spelled out, like what people can and can't do. Famously, at the San Francisco Zen Center, which is a very important part of the Zen world in the U.S., they now, instead of having an abbot, they have co-abbots, checks and balances to put two people in charge. We also see, I'm up to number 6, the prominence of women, striking number of women leaders. And in Asia, you see tons of women participating, and certainly there are really prominent nuns, but here you just see striking leadership of women, even in traditions that at home in Asia don't have women leadership. And then number 7, and this is one that I don't fully understand, and I'm hoping people will do more research on it, the overlap between therapy, psychotherapy, and Buddhism. The number of psychotherapists in the U.S. who identify with Buddhism in some way, sky high.
It's really striking. Now, Buddhism is a really psychological tradition. It talks about how the mind works. It talks about observing the mind. It talks about habits. So it can't be a complete surprise, but there's an overlap here, and I honestly don't fully understand the flow of influence back and forth, but I think it's pretty profound, and that's one of the things that'll be unfolding. Now, I'm going to conclude with just one thought, which is that if I compare this to China and the adaptation of Buddhism to China and how China changed because of Buddhism and Buddhism changed because of China, so much of what I've been describing to you is familiar. People answer their current problems with this wonderful new tradition that's come to them. That said, for us, it is happening so quickly here in the US because we have so much more mobility, so much more access. One thing that is strikingly true to the early Buddhist tradition that's happened here, and not true of East Asia, is that Buddhists and Buddhist institutions stay very clear of politics, except for social justice. And they usually aren't activists in that sense. They go and they help people as opposed to necessarily protesting. This is true of the early Buddhist tradition, but elsewhere in the Buddhist world, politics and Buddhism are all tied up. So what do we make of this? I can tell you that in China, there's a constant dialogue among Buddhists. Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? The farther away we get from the Buddha, are we losing it? Is the message getting garbled? Or are we keeping the tradition going? So there's a constant back and forth when we see change in the Buddhist tradition. And from within the Buddhist tradition, we hear reference to two principles. One is impermanence. Of course there's impermanence. Of course the Buddhist tradition is getting garbled because it's been all these years and we've had to translate it. On the other hand, Buddhists will constantly talk about another principle that helps them make sense and have a bit of a more favorable light to shine on all this change, and that is the Buddha had perfect, skillful means. He knew how to teach everyone. So when we see change in the Buddhist tradition, is it decline, or is it the emergence of skillful means, a new way of teaching the essentials of the tradition to a new audience? That's what the tradition is going to talk about. That's what the tradition does talk about. What's striking is, though, that in Asia, very rarely was a change made self-consciously and announced as a change. Here, folks are pretty comfortable. Americans are pretty confident. Asian Americans, convert Americans, everybody. So they say, we've decided this isn't important anymore, and we're going to do it this way now. So there's a certain American confidence in making these changes, but it's always back and forth. Are we losing something? Is this the workings of impermanence? Or is this just the expression of skillful means, just the tradition bringing itself to another generation? And with that, I'll stop and welcome your questions. So I'm tethered up here because of the microphone, but yes?
Were the Trappist monks so unique in supporting Thomas Merton in his pursuit of Buddhism, or did they support pursuit of other religions by other monks as well? I mean, because they're a Christian foundation, what was behind all this, and how did they finance his trips?
Yeah. He brought money in because of his writings. So he had a travel fund, but he still had to get permission because one of the striking differences between Buddhist monastics and Christian monastics is that Christian monastics generally take a vow of obedience. Buddhists don't. Poverty, yes. I mean, very simple life. Celibacy, yes, except in Japan, and only for men. But there's this question of obedience. And we actually, this is one of the things about Merton's life that we don't fully understand, but it's clear that there was a tug of war at times with his superiors. And even his autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain, got accepted at a press, and then all of a sudden they wouldn't allow it to be published, and they had to go all the way up the chain. I think they had to go to the guy in France who finally said, yeah, it's okay. Because there's someone in the US who wouldn't let it be published. So I actually think that he became famous fairly early in his monastic career and was bringing new people into the abbey. He was inspiring people to become monks. So he had a certain status, and he was able to kind of color outside the lines, because I don't know that other people would have been allowed to do what he did if they didn't have his status and bring in funds that would pay for him to do stuff like this. We do certainly have other folks coming out of the monastic orders and other priests at that period who were reading and thinking and doing Buddhist practice. I'm going to blank on the name. There's one particular guy who actually Oh, it's the guy I quoted earlier, the one to whom he said he wanted to be the best possible Buddhist. That guy actually got permission to practice Zen. I mean, from the hierarchy, they gave him permission, and he trained with the Asatani sensei for years. So there was a certain willingness to let the people who wanted to do that. But I think there was always tension, and it might have been different if he'd been in a different community. And when you read his later letters, it's clear he's feeling stifled. He wants more freedom. But at other times, he says he's grateful that he's being held to obedience. So it's hard to know. But he was certainly an unusual case and given unusual freedom because of his prominence. But you do have the sense that they thought of him as a little out of control, like a little bit of a loose cannon. They didn't know what was going to come out of his mouth next. But at the same time, many people looked up to him, and people had become monks because of him. Mid-20th century, that was a good thing for the Catholic Church. I mean, so, yeah, that was a long, rambling answer. Sorry. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
I think in your first point, you said that Merton looked to the east to solve the problems of the West.
Well, I was saying many people did that. I think he was looking both. He was looking to both. But
what were the problems?
He saw people living in a spiritual vacuum, caught up in materialism, kind of just the alienation of a modern economy where you're no longer tethered to a tight community necessarily, and just a sense of what's the meaning to this, like prosperity but not meaning. Yeah, I think that's definitely what he meant and what he felt. And he was someone who had grown up kind of moving around, suffered a lot of death in his family, lost his only brother. His parents had already died by the time he became a monk. In fact, he became a monk just as World War II was really taking off, and his younger brother came to visit him at Gethsemane to say goodbye before he went to go fight in the war and died in the war. So he had no immediate family left at all. And so I think he was really, what does life mean? What are we doing? So he happily stepped away from getting a PhD in English to instead pursue this life of writing and contemplation, or I should say contemplation and writing, because he would put it first. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that his background was both Quaker and
Church of England. Although very light.
Do you have any indication of his maintaining or pursuing connections with Quakers?
I haven't looked for it, but I haven't seen reference to it. It was actually his mother's family that was Quaker, and his mother died when he was really young, like 6 or 7. And then he was with his mother's parents, but I don't know if he was going to meeting. I don't know what he was doing. Some people have tried to draw a line between the silence and Quaker meeting to his interest in silence and contemplation. I don't know, because we see so many spiritual and religious people value silence. I don't know if we can draw a straight line back to Quakerism, but yeah, I've never seen anybody look too closely at that, so I wonder if we just don't know. We don't have evidence, but who knows? Other thoughts or questions, comments, stories?
Languages do you speak, and what are they?
Not as many as some of my colleagues. My main research language is Chinese, classical Chinese. I read scholarship in modern Chinese, Japanese, but my Japanese is dreadful. And I read French and German. And I don't have Latin or Greek. If I had another language, it would be Korean. If I could choose. Oh, and I've studied Sanskrit. I just never use it because I work on Buddhists in China everything had already been translated, and they were no longer in touch with India. So I've studied it, but I never use it. So when I was in India, I was getting a bit of Sanskrit back from the Hindi, but yeah. But I could tell you stories. There are people in my field who have every language you need to get across the Silk Road. Like every oasis state, they know that language. But I just have, I just work in Chinese. So there's a hand in the back.
Going back to the first point that you made about Merton, he was saying that the corrective for the ills of the world was spiritual, not economic or social or political or something. Yet it's a quasi-empirical approach of trying to reconcile those two. And it also seems like sort of a pessimistic outlook unless he thinks everybody is going to become enlightened in some way.
Right.
Just not getting the concept.
Yeah. Well, if we talk about what the modern is many things, and one of its main things, I think this is what you're referring to, is the very idea of modernity is built on the idea that things are going to get better, right? Progress, that we're going to make progress. But we often find in religious traditions that they have the sense that the real problems, the most important problems, have always been with us. So people have already tried solving them and maybe found solutions. And you know, as he says, you know, technology can't solve the problem of modern life, which he sees as a spiritual vacuum. That said, I mean, what else is the modern? The modern is science. And I'm trying not to call this scientific because I don't think we can call it fully scientific. It's the same idea of wanting to prove it for yourself and not just take it on authority. And again, that's so typically modern, I think, and very American. So I see that kind of across the board. Yeah, but the spiritual, it's hard to quantify. It's hard to get to. But it is an interesting mixture of the different characteristics of what we could call the modern, because some of it he's using, some of it he's rejecting. And he never says, oh, let's get rid of cars and he never is anti-technology, as far as I know. He's simply saying all of this this improvement in quality of life doesn't actually solve the most basic problems, and you can still, as we all know, have great prosperity and be miserable, right? And people now talk about affluenza, right? The problems of the affluent West. You know, people will just, you know, my students will say, you know, they'll come in and ask for an extension and then explain why, and they say, I know it's a first world problem. It's okay, it's still a real problem. Problems are problems. But what we see here is a mixture of, you know, discontent with the modern West, but also relying heavily on the characteristics of the modern West, wanting proof and wanting progress, and also being ambitious. This idea that this elite monastic practice of meditation, you can just walk in off the street and start with it, that's really a very modern thing. We find it in Asia now too, but it's a very modern Buddhism, and not just modern Western, but modern Buddhism thing to start everybody off on meditation, because that's just not what we see for the vast majority of Buddhist history. So that's been really interesting to see that take off across. In fact, a lot of the everybody can meditate attitude that we find in the West comes from those movements in Asia, in Burma, and other places where teachers just said, I'll take anybody. Come in here, sit down, I'll teach you how to meditate. It's going to improve your life, and you're going to be more like the Buddha and move toward awakening. So, modern ambition.
Other have a spiritual event. He was so young when he knew what side, what direction he went.
Yeah.
Is there an individual that influenced him strongly?
Yeah, no, there's not one person who looms really large at that period. It seems to have been more of an accumulation of conversations with people that led to his conversion and then ultimately to realizing that he had a vocation. He also had, you know, he kind of had a little bit of a bad boy past. Well, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but he very likely got a young woman pregnant when he was in college in England, and his father bought her off. We don't know what became of them. Some people think that both of them died in the Blitz. But that's why he ended up at Columbia, is because he had to leave Cambridge because he got in so much trouble. And the story is that he approached, I think, the Franciscans and was really impressed with the Franciscans and loved St. Francis, and the Franciscans, when he told them about this, said, we're not sure about you. And it was only then that he later ended up with the Trappists. So it was more like he was talking to a lot of people and feeling really impressed by them, but then he had to find the people that would take him. So. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely a seeker. Yeah. Absolutely a seeker. And I would say he definitely had some epiphanies, but they're not necessarily directly connected to his original conversion. And one of those three kind of major experiences that he had was on the Asian trip in Sri Lanka. He had what he described as a moment of unbelievable, complete clarity, looking at these ancient statues of the Buddha in Sri Lanka.
But that was much later.
Yeah, this was 68, so he had multiple experiences, but it isn't a single one of them that accounts for his conversion. Yeah, actually one of them, if you go to Louisville, Kentucky, they have a plaque on the street that says here, Father, I think they actually use his monastic name, Father Thomas Merton had this experience because he had a moment when he'd been at Gethsemane and he had to go into Louisville for some reason, and he looked out at the people and he just had this moment of overflowing love for everybody he saw. Just one of these moments that changed him, and he wrote about it at great length. Or not at great length, but he wrote about it and wanted to tell everybody and share this insight that they too should have. And so one in Sri Lanka, and I'm having trouble remembering the third one that people identify as one of these moments, but none of them is directly connected to the conversion. And there was one hand way in the back that.
You talked this the Buddhist and Catholic, and I'm trying to recall a quote, which is provocative. It came from Joseph Ratzinger, I think maybe before he was, and you must know what I'm getting at.
Nihilism?
What's that?
Was it Buddhism is nihilism?
No.
Wasn't that one?
And I'm not sure he was talking about Buddhism only, maybe, but he said, he used the word spiritual autoeroticism.
Yes. I've seen this
and
phrase,
I wondered what you thought Merton might have thought about. I mean, I understand, I think what he's getting at, and it's probably going to the heart of the difference between Christian and Catholic and Buddhist.
Right. I would say also that there is a tension within Catholicism, there's a tension within Christianity about mysticism. Some people are comfortable with mystics. Some people really are made uncomfortable by these folks. They're hard to control. I mean, look at St. Teresa of Avila. The church, they barely kept her out of trouble. And yet now she's revered and remembered as this great mystic. So I think Ratzinger isn't, are you still alive? It's just the name changes throw me off. So I don't think that he is one of those people who's comfortable with mystics. So I'm not sure that expression, he might even use it for Christian mystics if he feels they're not really making contact with the divine. And I'm not sure that he's one of those people who believes it's possible to make that kind of free-form contact with the divine. I think he would think one has contact with God at the proper moment, in the proper ritual, in the proper community. Like there's a power to that the mystics have that I think he's just uncomfortable with. So I don't know that it's necessary, but Buddhists are definitely not making contact with God in his view. And so, yeah. Ratzinger, yeah. So our, what do we call him? The Pope Emeritus? I don't know what we call him. Pope, I don't know what we're calling him. The retired Pope. It's new to have a Pope who's alive, but not the Pope anymore. So. Yeah, 2 popes. There have been 2 popes before, but yeah. Last time there were 2 popes, they were in different cities and rivals. So. There was one more hand? Oh, yes.
Was Merton involved in the civil rights movement?
He died in 68, and he clearly was sympathetic. He talks about getting a lot of requests to come and speak and to be involved, and he examined his conscience and decided he needed to stay at the Abbey and continue his work. So he did not get all that actively involved, although it's clear he was sympathetic. So I think he was supportive, but did not get pulled into it too much. It is one of the things that's striking when one reads about the lead up to his trip to Asia in 68. And I was born in 68, and my father has always my whole life said, 68, that was the worst year, except for you being born. Which I was thinking about because Merton talks about, what a horror, he calls it a beast of a year. What a terrible year 1968 was, because things are just going to hell in a handbasket, and people are getting assassinated, and it's just a horrible year. And so he was sort of looking forward to this trip as maybe turning the corner on some of that. So he definitely, I think, was very aware of what was going on, but he didn't get out in the streets. As far as I know, I think he was quite consciously trying to sort of stay on track with his contemplative life. I also don't know what his superiors at the monastery, at the abbey, would have thought, because again, the church was kind of in a variety of places with political involvement, activism in that particular issue. So I don't know. I don't know the full answer, and I don't know if there is an answer. I know I saw at least.
Because of the title they gave to the presentation, I'm curious with the Silk Road, you know, the centuries of contact. Back several hundred years ago, were Western people who went to India and China attracted?
No, yes, we definitely have stories of, certainly by the 19th century, we've got visitors to Tibet who were quite enthralled. But even earlier, not too much. You have to remember who was traveling, because most of the folks who were going to Asia from Europe, mostly, and then later the U.S., early on, were either, there were actually three categories. They were merchants, they were military, or they were missionaries. And there wasn't necessarily a lot of room there. That said, some of our earliest and most important scholars of Buddhism were missionaries, Jesuits, Methodists, you name it. And in some of them, you definitely feel there's a lot of appreciation for these traditions, that they're kind of doing what Merton did and seeing a lot of wisdom and finding commonality with it. But they were not in a time or a place where they could fully acknowledge that, given what in those centuries Christianity was understood to be, which was not just an exclusive identity, but a proselytizing a proselytizing faith. We have a few free-spirited folks who are traveling, who are untethered and getting interested in this, but not as much as you'd think. Not as much as you'd think. And famously, Matteo Ricci, the great Jesuit, who was one of the first to go to China and really understand it, he was quite enthralled by Confucianism, and the Vatican did not like that. They did not like that, and they really pulled back on that. In 19th into 20th century, we do get literature coming out of Asia being translated. So we can go back. The Transcendentalists had some contact with both Hinduism and Buddhism, but again, it was really limited. Actually, there's this one. I think it's Emerson who called, and it's a fascinating thing to do. Emerson, in a review of Walt Whitman, called him an American Buddhist, an American Buddha. What does he mean? I have no idea what he means. And then T.S. Eliot studied Sanskrit, and if you've read The Wasteland, he has Shanti, Shanti, Shanti in it, which is Hindu, not Buddhist. But there was contact, but it was often very attenuated. And we all understand things through our own lenses, and in those early contacts, you can very much see that there isn't all that much understanding yet of the basic principles. And it's also difficult because the Buddhist canon is vast. It's huge. It's not like there's one book you can translate and say, that's it. Like this contains all of it. It's a really, really complex tradition. And so it's, you can't go back to one original text and have that be representative of everything. And that's made it a little bit harder for things to come through. Now, I feel like I should let all of you go, but if anybody, it's late, but if anybody wants to linger and ask questions, I'm happy to stay for a little while before we get back on the road to Middlebury. So, thanks so much for your attention. This is fun.